Welcome to another episode of The Brand Called You, a podcast and podcast show that brings you leadership lessons, knowledge, experience, and wisdom from thousands of successful individuals from around the world. I'm your host, Ashutosh Garg, and today I'm delighted and privileged to welcome a very, very senior and accomplished professor from California, USA, Professor Anna Lembke. Anna, welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me.
Professor Lembke is a professor of psychiatry and addiction medicine at Stanford University. She's an author, and all of you know I'm always very partial to authors. So she's an author of a book titled Dopamine Nation, Finding Balance in the Age of Indulgence. And she has also appeared in the Netflix documentary, The Social Dilemma. So Anna, before we start talking about your book, tell me a little bit about your own journey.
You know, I would describe myself as a wanderer. I was not one of those people who knew early on what I wanted to do. I had a long list of things I thought I didn't want to do. And one of them included being a doctor. And of course, I became a doctor almost by default because I couldn't find a regular job. They said I was overeducated for all the regular jobs I applied for. So medical school was kind of a default, but it was also, of course, with the idea that, well, I want to add something good to the world. I want to help people. And I really enjoyed medical school. You know, once I got there, I realized it was a good fit for me. But then I had trouble choosing what brand of medicine to go into. I thought, oh, well, I don't know what kind of doctor I want to be, but I definitely don't want to be a psychiatrist. And of course, I became a psychiatrist. So this is sort of the ongoing story. When I first started to practice psychiatry, which I ultimately chose because I felt it was important to improve the quality of people's lives, not just the quantity of their lives. And then when I went into psychiatry, I said, well, I'll treat all kinds of mental health disorders, but not addiction. I'm not going to treat addiction. So, you know, you don't necessarily have to be one of those people who knows exactly what you're going to do and aims for it. You can wander your way there.
Fascinating. So, you know, your book, Dopamine Nation, Finding Balance in the Age of Indulgence, combines the neuroscience of addiction with the wisdom of recovery to explore the problem of compulsive overconsumption in a dopamine overloaded world. My first question to you is, what inspired you to write the book?
I was inspired to write the book because I was seeing increasing numbers of people coming to my office for help with anxiety, depression, inattention, overall despair, despite the fact that they had loving families, a robust social network, interesting jobs, access to privileged education, and otherwise good health. It was really a conundrum, which I now call the plenty paradox, which is to say, why is it in the heart of Silicon Valley, when we have so much, we're so unhappy? What I was seeing in Silicon Valley was being mirrored in wealthy nations around the world. That is to say, in the past 20 years, people are more unhappy than they were 20 years ago. And people are most unhappy in the wealthiest nations.
Correct.
Likewise, we see rising rates of depression and anxiety, and in some cases, suicide. All over the world, but those rates are climbing fastest in the richest countries, which begs the question, why, again, when we are so fortunate, we have so much, are we increasingly miserable? And I think we can look to the neuroscience of pleasure and pain to understand that, because what happens is that our brains were not evolved for this world of plenty. We were evolved for a world of scarcity and ever-present danger. And the flooding of highly reinforcing substances and behaviors is essentially overloading our brains. And in order to compensate, our brains are down-regulating dopamine and other feel-good neurotransmitters, putting us into this state of depression.
Amazing. And before we go into any further questions, for my viewers and listeners, how do you define dopamine and what is its role in modern day society?
So dopamine is a chemical that we make in our brains.
Correct.
It's essential for the experience of pleasure, reward, and motivation. The more dopamine that's released in a part of our brain called the reward pathway, and the faster it's released, the more reinforcing and potentially addictive is that substance or that behavior. Because we can get addicted to behaviors like pornography, gambling, gaming, shopping, just as we can get addicted to drugs and alcohol. So dopamine is fundamental to the experience of pleasure, reward, and motivation. It's a neurotransmitter. Neurotransmitters are molecules that bridge the gap between neurons. So neurons are these, basically our brains are a collection of wires, right? But those wires don't touch end to end. There's a little space between them called the synapse. That synapse is bridged by small molecular messengers called neurotransmitters, and dopamine is one of those molecular messengers.
Okay, thank you. I've learned something new as well today.
Oh,
so,
good.
When you talk about dopamine fasting, what does it mean and how can it be beneficial?
So I think in order to understand why dopamine fasting, which is essentially cutting out our drug of choice for a period of time long enough to reset reward pathways, the reason that it's important for us to engage in dopamine fasting is because when we chronically expose our brain to highly reinforcing drugs and behaviors, which release a lot of dopamine in the reward pathway, our brains compensate by downregulating dopamine production and dopamine transmission, not just to baseline levels, but actually below baseline levels. And that feels exactly like depression, anxiety, insomnia, and craving. We're always releasing dopamine at a tonic baseline level. Dopamine is the heartbeat of our brain.
Wow. Okay.
But when we do things that are highly reinforcing, like smoke cigarettes, drink alcohol, use cannabis, watch pornography, play video games, dopamine firing increases above baseline temporarily. But one of the driving forces in our brains is to restore what neuroscientists call homeostasis, or that baseline level of dopamine firing. The way our brains do that is to decrease dopamine transmission, again, not just to baseline, but below baseline. And that we experience as craving, anxiety, restlessness, insomnia, dysphoria.
Wow.
And if we repeatedly expose our brains to dopamine, we essentially get stuck in that dopamine deficit state. So we get stuck in a place where dopamine firing is below healthy baseline levels. So we have to remove our drug of choice for long enough, on average 4 weeks, in order for our brains to get the message that it's okay to start making more dopamine and bring us back to those healthy levels so that we can enjoy more modest rewards again.
You also talk about the connection between addiction and dopamine. Help me understand this, and if possible, give me an example. Okay,
so I think one of the metaphors that I use in the book is the extended metaphor of a balance. So imagine that there's a teeter-totter on a central fulcrum, and that's how we process pleasure and pain in our brain. Pleasure and pain are co-located. So the same parts of the brain that process pleasure also process pain. They work like opposite sides of a balance. So when we experience pleasure, it tips one way, pain, it tips the other. There are certain rules governing this balance. The most important is the balance wants to stay level, or what neuroscientists call homeostasis. The way that we restore a level balance is first by tilting an equal and opposite amount to the side of pain. And I like to imagine that as these neuroadaptation gremlins hopping on the pain side of the balance to bring us level again. But the gremlins like it on the balance, so they don't hop off as soon as it's level. They stay on until it's tilted to the side of pain. That's the come down, the hangover, the after effect. Now, if we wait long enough, those gremlins hop off and homeostasis is restored. But if we repeatedly expose our brains to highly reinforcing drugs and behaviors, those gremlins on the pain side of the balance start to multiply until we have enough gremlins to fill this whole room. And now we're in a dopamine deficit state. And this is the addicted brain. Once we're in that dopamine deficit state, we need to keep using our drug, not to feel good, but just to level the balance and feel normal. One example would be an individual who is looking at pornography repeatedly over time. essentially is accumulating these neuroadaptation gremlins on the pain side of the balance, then they need to look at pornography more often and more potent forms, spending more and more of their day and their time and their resources looking at pornography or playing video games or watching TikTok or smoking pot or whatever it is, until pretty soon they need their drug not to get high, but just to feel normal. And importantly, when they're not using, they're walking around with a balance tilted to the side of pain, experiencing the universal symptoms of withdrawal from any addictive substance, which are anxiety, irritability, insomnia, dysphoria, and craving. And this is what drives addictive reuse and why people relapse even when they know they want to stop.
You know, when I was preparing to have my conversation with you, I was reading a little bit, and it was an interesting comment that I read that social media gives the young a dopamine fix. I made a mental note, and I thought I'm going to ask Professor Lembke about this. What does this mean? And is social media something which is addictive?
Social media is a drug. It's essentially drugified human connection. So when we make a connection with another human being, which, by the way, we need to do to survive. So from an evolutionary perspective, we are wired to come together in social groups. That helps us find mates, helps us steward scarce resources, helps us protect ourselves from enemies. And when we make an intimate human connection, which usually takes a lot of effort and work, right? We have to go out, we have to find the people, we have to put the work into the relationship. But when we make that intimate human connection, we get the release of dopamine, our pleasure neurotransmitter, in our brains, and it feels good. And that then motivates us to keep making those connections. But what social media has done, as it has allowed us to have very potent connections instantaneously with minimal or no work, right? So from my couch, I can just swipe right or swipe left. I can see a beautiful face. If someone says something I don't like, I can just unfriend them and move on to somebody else. So without doing any effort, my brain is lighting up and full of dopamine in response to these images and these connections. And so naturally, of course, my brain has to compensate for that surge of dopamine by down-regulating dopamine transmission. And again, after a while, this face isn't that interesting. I need a more beautiful face, or I need, 10 more faces, or I need something outrageous. The other thing too is that we experience a rush of dopamine when we have an emotion at the same time as another person has an emotion. Right. And again, that's adaptive and healthy and helps us kind of wire together. It's like human Wi-Fi. But the problem is now you've got an audience of thousands, if not millions of individuals who are all outraged at the same time or laughing at the same time. And it's a very, very potent drug. Again, more potent than our primitive brains were adapted for. And as a response, we are reeling.
Wow. Thank you. What a great response. My next question to you is that how can individuals recognize and break addictive patterns of behavior?
So we talk about addiction as consisting of the 3 C's: control, compulsion, and consequences. So out of control use. For example, I tried to cut back or stop using, and repeatedly I was not able to. Compulsions has to do with a kind of mental obsession or preoccupation with my drug to the exclusion of anything else, as well as a level of automaticity to it. Again, I'm initiating drug use even when I didn't plan to or want to. And by the way, I'm using the word drug very broadly to include not just things we put in our body, but things we do, including consuming digital media. Correct. And then consequences is all of the consequences related to our use when we're harming ourselves and or harming other people. The broadest definition of addiction is the continued compulsive use of a substance or behavior despite harm to self and or others. So, but I would also add that some soft signs of addiction are if we find ourselves lying. So this is very interesting. People with addiction get into the lying habit, A saying that we often use here is, you are only as sick as your secrets. And so this kind of double life, where on the one hand, I'm an upstanding citizen, and on the other hand, I'm doing these things that I'm ashamed of, I'm addicted, I'm lying about it. So lying is a big symptom of addiction. A softer sign too is the gradual progression toward depression, anxiety, insomnia, irritability. Because as I talked about, every drug ultimately puts us in that dopamine deficit state where we are less happy with ourselves, less happy with our circumstances, less happy with the world. Ultimately, we can even progress to anhedonia, or the inability to take joy in any aspect of our lives.
Amazing. And what advice would you give to someone struggling with addiction or seeking to reduce the dependence on dopamine-inducing substances?
Yeah, so in my book, I talk about this framework that people can use. It's based on dopamine as an acronym.
Correct.
D stands for data. That's where we just write down on a piece of paper, or tell a friend, or tell a mental health professional what we are doing, how much and how often. So for me personally, in the book, I write about how I got addicted to romance novels. And I really only realized this when I was telling a colleague that I was spending a lot of time staying up late at night reading, even sometimes bringing books to work and escaping in this kind of fiction. And it wasn't until I said it that I really saw it. So we have a funny way where we can kind of squint our eyes and not see it. But when we write it down or tell another human being, it becomes real to us in a way it's otherwise not real. So that's the first step, awareness of our behaviors. The O stands for objectives. That's where we kind of think about, well, why do I do this behavior? What does it do for me? For me personally, reading romance novels was just the great escape, right? I didn't have to think for a while. I didn't have to be in my body or in my own mind. The P stands for problems. So again, we can write this down in a journal or tell another human being, what are all the problems associated with it? Sometimes it's obvious problems, like I'm not doing my schoolwork, I'm not doing my job. Sometimes it's more subtle problems, like I'm having conflicts with my partner, my parents, my siblings, my friends, or I'm just doing things that are contrary to my values and goals.
Correct.
The A of the acronym stands for abstinence, or even asceticism, if you want to know the truth, because one of the things I prescribe to my patients is to intentionally do things that are hard. Because by pressing on the pain side of the balance, we get those neuroadaptation gremlins to hop on the pleasure side, and we can get our dopamine indirectly through hormesis. Hormesis is Greek for to set in motion. So what we're doing when we're exercising or doing ice cold water plunges is that we're actually triggering our body to stimulate our own healing mechanisms and upregulate our own feel-good neurotransmitters like dopamine, serotonin, norepinephrine, etc. But the key is abstinence, where we decide, this is my drug. We eliminate it for 4 weeks. We know that in the first 2 weeks, we're going to feel worse before we feel better. But if we can just stop using for 4 weeks, we're going to come out the other side with more joy, more ability to see the true impact of our drug use on our lives. And then even if we go back to using that drug, we can do it from a place of a restored dopamine reward pathway, where we're in a healthier dopamine place, and we can plan for how to go back to using that substance in a healthier way.
Interesting. My next question is that how can parents ensure children are developing healthy dopamine habits?
I think it's really important for parents to recognize that asking your child to do things that are difficult, hard, or even physically painful is actually good for children. It is not our job as parents to completely insulate our children from pain and make sure that everything is fun for them. And I don't know how it is in India, but I can tell you in the United States, this is what parents have been acculturated to believe. They have to protect their children from any kind of trauma or injury. Otherwise, their child is going to grow up and be mentally ill and end up on, Freud's couch, having to recount their traumatic childhoods. Yeah. The problem is that we are now protecting kids so much from any kind of discomfort, much less pain, that they're not building up the mental calluses they need to thrive in the adult world. So first of all, children under the age of 12 should not have their own digital devices and should not have unsupervised access to the internet. We need to carefully monitor what they watch, how much, and how often, because quantity and frequency matter. The more screens our kids look at, the more likely they are to get addicted to screens. So we need to really bring down the time that they're watching, limit it to a couple days a week outside of doing schoolwork. But even schoolwork, we have to carefully monitor, because here in the United States, there's a lot of kids saying, oh, I'm doing my work, but they're not doing their work at all. So parents are having a lot of difficulty supervising this. Once kids get to be teenagers, they're basically going to go out and get their own phones, and you don't have control over what they do. So you have to have a lot of conversations in the family early on about the addictive nature of digital media. We have to identify this as a drug. That if used in moderation in adults is okay, but if used to excess can become a source of real despair and suffering in life. And just talk about it, talk about it openly. The other thing parents need to do is they need to model what they want to see in their children. Yes. I have a lot of parents come into my clinic and they say, my kid's on his screen all day. And right in the middle of our discussion, they're pulling out their phone and on their screen. So we can't ask our kids to give up their devices unless we too are willing to give up their devices. Right. And the ways to do that are, again, develop some kind of social etiquette and guardrails around screen use. Maybe there's rules in the family, like nobody goes on their screens until 8 a.m. in the morning, and everybody gets off screens at 5 p.m. in the night, and we gather all the phones together and put them in a safe so nobody's using screens beyond that time. No screens in the bedroom. No screens at the dinner table. No screens when we're having a social event and we're greeting guests and talking with friends. Kids need to, parents have an obligation to socialize children. Again, I don't know how it is in India, but here in the United States, you can go to an event where children are gathered. They don't make eye contact. They don't shake hands. They don't speak to adults. Many times they're inarticulate and can't speak because they're all on their screens.
I think Indian kids are not very much different from the American kids. And there is the added pressure that Indian parents put on kids. We've never been taught that it's okay to fail. It's always come first in class, head of the line, et cetera, And I'm sure you've met a lot of them.
That's an excellent point, because I can tell you, after many years of treating people with severe addictions, one of the recurring themes in their early childhood is parents who are narcissistically invested in them and using them as an extension to validate their own achievement as parents. I have patients who even talk about every time their parent sees them, there's a kind of scanning of their face for defects, an emphasis on external beauty, external reputation, external accomplishments. So I have to work with families to completely reshift away from the external and focus on core values. How do we make good humans in the world, right? That should be our number one goal as parents. How do we make good citizens, good humans who care about other humans?
Very well said. Thank you for a great response. And my last question to you now, and this is for the many, many people who I'm encouraging to go to Amazon and check out Professor Anna Lembke's book, Dopamine Nation. What do you want readers to take away from your book?
I want readers to realize that we are all human. We are all prone to compulsive overconsumption and in some cases, severe addiction. We're living in a very stressful time, which is stressful in paradoxical ways. It's the stress of overabundance. But if we come together, we can recognize the ways in which modern life is stressful, the ways in which we're all vulnerable. We can build a world within a world that emphasizes, again, these core values, which ultimately make us feel that we have had more satisfied lives. Happiness is not what we should be aiming for. We should be aiming to be good people who care about each other and who live according to our values. And also, very importantly, that life is hard and we all suffer. And that's normal and okay. And in fact, on some level, we need to seek out some degree of suffering and accept our hardship in order to feel contented and serene in our existence.
Fabulous. And on that note, thank you so much for speaking to me about your journey. Thank you for sharing your own dopamine fix with your romance novels. Thank you very much for talking about your personal experience. Thank you for speaking to me about your book, Dopamine Nation, Finding Balance in the Age of Indulgence. In this conversation, I think I have learned a lot of new things from you. And I'm sure a lot of our viewers and listeners will take away a lot from our conversation, and especially what you spoke about young children and young parents. Thank you again for speaking to me, and good luck to you.
Oh, well, thank you. It's such an honor to be able to speak to you and to the people of India.
Thank you for listening to the Brand Called You videocast and podcast, a platform that brings you knowledge, experience, and wisdom of hundreds of successful individuals from around the world. Do visit our website www.tbcy.in to watch and listen to the stories of many more individuals. You can also follow us on YouTube, Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. Just search for the Brand Called You.